All right, one more guest to go here on this Wednesday edition of Bang the Book Radio. That is Mr. Wes Reynolds at Wes Reynolds and the number 1 on Twitter. Wes, how's it going today?
Going well, Adam. How about yourself, sir?
Doing well. Appreciate your time as always. Thank you so much for joining us here. And you know what? Let's go ahead and talk a little bit of NHL. I know I sent over some NFL, talking points for you here. Early season NHL betting approach. What is yours?
Really, I'm kind of actually evaluating that. I did play some futures. A lot of it, I don't know how heavy I'm going to get in the first couple weeks, maybe some spot plays, but, you kind of do want to see these teams a little bit. I mean, I think I have, some of the teams that might have some high expectations, may struggle out of the gate, but I don't think it's necessarily, pushing the panic button on some of the better teams. I mean, you would think in the East, I think Pittsburgh's still a contender. I really like Tampa Bay this year. I think, when you lose your best player, I think they got decimated by injuries and ended up not making the playoffs when I felt that probably at full strength last year they were one of the 3 or 4 better teams in the Eastern Conference. Looking at that, I mean, the strong teams, a lot of people are very high on Edmonton this year. And, there's your usual teams, Chicago and San Jose. Maybe a year for some dark horses to kind of take a step up, like someone like Calgary or Dallas. Those are kind of a couple longer shots I played on the futures board this year. But, it'll be an interesting to see the start. I think you might see some mediocre to bad teams get off to good starts, and then you'll see some good teams get off to so-so starts.
Well, and what's so challenging is that, there's just so much going on right now with college football and the NFL and Major League Baseball playoffs, and people are getting ready for the NBA as well, which starts in, about 3 weeks or so. So it's just hard to be up to date on everything that's going on in the NHL market. And I completely agree with you in the sense of keeping exposure low for the first few games. I mean, see what you've got with these teams because there's a lot of timing involved in the NHL. I don't know how closely people watch it, but you got to find line combinations that work. You're playing with a lot of new teammates. There's just a lot going on. There's a lot of roster turnover in the NHL. Young players, very young players. I mean, you see 17 and 18-year-old kids playing in the NHL on a regular basis, it feels like. So, I agree with your approach that, you keep things light early on in the season and like you said, maybe look for some of those spot plays early on. And that's really a hallmark of my NHL handicapping to begin with is I think situational edges, both in the NHL and the NBA, are very, very significant.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm going just on my own experience. Sometimes, the whole thing about this as sports bettors is you got to learn, and you learn from mistakes. And my mistake last year is I kind of went fired out of the gates to start the season and ended up in a hole that I was able to, dig most of the way out of. But I really started off poorly personally betting last year. I mean, we oftentimes, it's a long-term thing, but sometimes you're going to have bad seasons. And I started out bad personally betting in the NHL season and, probably got a little bit aggressive. So that's why I'm taking a little bit more of a cautious approach.
And, there's nothing wrong with doing that. The season is 6 months long. It's 82 games for each team. You're going to have plenty of opportunities if you want to go out there and bet the NHL. It's not like the NFL or college football where, in college football teams play 13, maybe 14 games on the high end. In the NFL, they play 16, maybe as many as 19 in the playoffs. In the NHL, you've got 82 games. You've got that daily grind. You've got long road trips for these teams. So, yeah, you really don't need to go balls out right out of the gate.
No, not at all. And I think and it's one of the things, too, as sports bettors, you have to evaluate your strengths. Hockey I wouldn't consider necessarily one of my stronger sports. Like college basketball I would consider a lot better, and maybe I can be a little bit more aggressive because I have a more day-to-day knowledge of the teams and of the game that I can get by. But, with NHL, I really got to put in the work to to keep up with these teams. And there's some people that have a natural knack for hockey. So it's really kind of, evaluating your own strengths, in terms of what you decide to maybe get more aggressive in and what you might take a more conservative approach. And there's nothing wrong with taking a conservative approach in certain sports.
Well, and I guess that's the last point we'll talk about here, and we'll get into some NFL stuff, is for those that follow your work on Twitter, you are a high-volume handicapper. I mean, you do golf, you do NASCAR, you do UFC, you do all the major betting markets. I know you do some tennis stuff as well. You pretty much hit on just about everything you can. So how hard is that for you to have that willpower and that resistance to not dive in right away?
It is hard. I mean, you have to be willing to, it's maybe the old adage of listen to everyone but follow no one. But, I mean, you really, I think, have to look at, guys that are maybe stronger in some other sports and, don't be afraid to kind of, see what they're doing and, not necessarily just follow plays, but, look at how they approach things if there's something that you don't have as much of a knowledge of. And I mean, you can know a little about everything, but a lot about nothing, basically. And I mean, there's only a few sports that I think, each day-to-day sports bettor really, really knows. And then there's some where, you may utilize some of your resources or some of your network, if you have a network on social media or if you have friends and colleagues that bet certain sports where, hey, this guy, I might be a better basketball guy, but this guy's a better hockey guy. And, you kind of, maybe work together a little bit or seek each other's counsel. So, that's what I think, the key to this, if you're going to bet multiple sports. And there's nothing wrong with specializing necessarily either. I mean, know what your wheelhouse is. I mean, if you're really good in the NFL, concentrate on the NFL. And I mean that, and I'm trying to do a little bit more of that. I mean, there will be times, with NHL where I might not have a play for a few days. And I mean, the fact that, the odds makers got to put the lines and the prices out on every game, every night, but you don't necessarily have to bet them every game, every night.
All right, I had a listener question with regards to buying points here, and I believe the context of the question was mostly looking at Monday Night Football. So we'll start with a discussion about buying points in the NFL. Is that something you do? Is that something you recommend?
It is something I do from time to time. It varies on the situation. I mean, now with the NFL, because the key numbers are so pronounced, you're going to pay a lot more than traditionally you might on a basketball game because, we've had this conversation before. I think there are sometimes some key numbers on basketball spreads. And, when you're buying points, you're buying, half a point is another 10 cents. So, buying up from 6.5 to 7 in basketball is $1.20. In something like the NFL, where it's more of a key number, you're talking minus 125, minus 130, depending on the individual book's exposure or what they have wagered on the game. But, I think the key numbers, I mean, they make you pay for them in the NFL because there are key numbers, with the 3 and the 7. And sometimes if you look at a line screen, you'll see some of these books that'll have like minus a such and such plus 115 or plus 120, and a lot of that is teaser protection because, when you hear all these guys that put out maybe, okay, pros versus Joes or, where are we getting the sharp money or where are we getting the public money, keep in mind that's not just straight bets, that's also teasers and parlays, and especially teasers. With some of these games. So you definitely have to take that into account.
Well, and of course, for day of the game bettors, that's a question that we had last week or 2 weeks ago, something like that, about some betting tips for day of the game. If you want a particular number on the day of the game, odds are you're going to be able to find it. Now, if you do have, only one sports book at your disposal, maybe you do have to think a little bit more about buying a hook or something like that to get onto a number that you want. But if you've got multiple books, more often than not, you should be able to find the number that you're looking for there. Wes, let's talk about a few of these games here and look at some of these different handicapping angles that we've got for this week. Let's look at the Thursday night game here between New England and Tampa Bay. New England, anywhere from a 5 to a 6-point favorite. The 6 out there at Bovada, that's hardly a big surprise. The 5 at the Chris Books, as well as DSI, 5.5 at Pinnacle, and a couple of others. This is a really interesting handicap because New England, a very public team, Thursday night, standalone game. You know where the public money is coming. But at the same time, defensively, they've just looked so bad.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very – I mean, it's not a surprise that New England, was getting the money from the opener of 4.5. But this isn't, necessarily, I think, an easy lay on the road here because, I mean, if you look at the Patriots' defense, they've allowed 1,827 yards through 4 games. 4 straight weeks, they've allowed a 300-plus yard quarterback in all of their games this season. If they were to keep their points pace, they would shatter the modern NFL record. I think it was the Saints back in 2012 where they allowed like over 7,000 yards. The Patriots, I think, would be on a pace for 7,300 yards. And, they're on a short week, so it's tough to get a quick fix. And, Bill Belichick definitely wants to get that fixed, but it's hard to lay that. And this number is interesting because it is in that range. It's not close enough to where it's 6.5, where you would get some people that would buy up to 7 and definitely take Tampa Bay as a home dog. It's kind of in that middle range, but it's in that range where you could see a lot of people trying to tease down the Patriots, if they were to get to 6 or even at 5.5, where they could tease that down to pick them with a game on Sunday, and I mean, it almost seems like I don't know if the odds maker is really telling you who he or she likes here, but it would make me lean to Tampa Bay. The fact that it's not higher actually. That maybe says that they're comfortable with the Patriots where they are, knowing that they're going to get Patriots money. I mean, could they come out and, I mean, the Patriots are a team, if any team can, I guess, flip a switch, they can, but I think this is hard to get a quick fix here on a short week for that defense. And I think you're going to see the total continue to rise. I think it's pretty much consensus 55, but it is a primetime game, and primetime games have had a pretty good knack for going over the total in recent years. So I think you're going to see that number likely continue to rise. I haven't decided what on this one yet, but if I had to, I'd probably take the Bucs at home.
I think you brought up a really good point, and this is something that I try to stress to listeners out there, is looking for context clues in the line. The books know, like you said, that they're getting public involvement on this game, on game day, and it's going to come in on New England. So the fact that they're not already sitting up there at 6 does tell you, like you said, that they're probably pretty comfortable with the number they're at, with the position that they're in. And it also says something to me that this number is not at 6 when everybody and their brother was against Tampa Bay last week. That number with the Giants actually came down to 2.5 at some books. The Giants haven't won a game this season, and they really haven't looked all that good. I know they're in a major market. They've been kind of a public team in the past, but the fact that there was enough steam on that game to bring it down to 3 with reduced juice or 2.5 was a really good sign of what was going on with Tampa Bay in the betting market. And again, the fact that this number is not higher, like you said, I think that the context clues here kind of say that Tampa Bay looks like the side. Now, taking Tampa Bay is obviously not an easy thing to do here against New England, but you want to look for context in the line. I think that is what the line is saying right now.
Yeah, for sure. And keep in mind that Tampa Bay also has the smaller sample size, like Miami, with the Irma canceling the Week 1 game. So they have only had 3 games. So you had them obviously look pretty good against the Bears in their home opener, but the Bears obviously now have made a quarterback change. Tampa did not look good against Minnesota, and then last week, I mean, they really couldn't get away from the Giants. So, is it kind of a thing where, like Seattle last Sunday, where in their first 3 games wasn't really anything that tickled your fancy or made you fall in love with the Seahawks based on the previous performances? That's also a thing here. You wonder if maybe Tampa's sitting on a really good game here after 3 kind of, okay effort, or they weren't great, were either bad or weren't great. So, maybe this is the potential good game that they could be sitting on here.
Well, and again, I mean, that game against Chicago turned the ball over on their own side of the 50 4 times. I think one of those, or maybe 2 of those, was returned for a touchdown. So it's not like Tampa Bay offensively did a ton in that game. They won the turnover battle, and, really Chicago lost the turnover battle, and that was that game. Also in this game, another thing that makes it interesting that the line isn't higher, Levante David out for Tampa Bay, Quan Alexander probably not going to play either. Those are 2 significant losses in the middle of this defense. Tampa Bay also probably missing 2 safeties, TJ Ward being one of them. 4 key injuries in the back 7 for Tampa Bay, going up against the New England offense that's been as efficient, as proficient as it always is, and yet this number still hasn't gone up to 6 or 7. So, again, just another example there of why it's so important to look at every possible angle in a game.
Yeah, and you've also got the New England offense is still very good, but you've got clearly the loss of Edelman, but they're obviously using Hogan, and he's filled in nicely, and I think they're still trying to figure out how to use maybe some guys. Dwayne Allen, who of course was with the Colts. And I think they use Dwayne more as a blocker because, I mean, when you've got Gronk, I mean, you don't really need to throw a ton of balls Dwayne Allen's way. But, you have Dwayne Allen and Philip Dorsett, both former Colts. I mean, they're still trying to, I think, incorporate some different people in the offense. And, Brady's modus operandi is to really spread that ball around, and you'll have several receivers with a catch. And, particularly not with your typical go-to, X wide receiver. So, they're still trying to figure things out. Not worried about them offensively, but just their defense. And I think this total is going to likely continue to rise. I wouldn't be shocked if it was 56.5, 57 by tomorrow.
Yeah, New England also working Brandon Cooks in, who's another new guy. So, again, I mean, I know we've spent a lot of time on this game, but it is such a fascinating handicap for a lot of different reasons. And we've outlined, really the only negative we've outlined for New England at this point is their defense. And this number still hasn't climbed up all that much. It's still in that dead zone between 4 and 6, where sharp money could swing the balance either way. So definitely a very interesting one to watch. And as I'm looking at the odds screen here, I know I didn't mention this game to you, but I do want to touch on it now that I'm looking at it, is game 453, 454, Buffalo and Cincinnati. Saw Cincinnati firsthand. I went to that Browns-Bengals game on Sunday. 2 takeaways. 1, the Bengals aren't as bad as they played. 2, the Browns are pretty much as bad as they've played. Now, in this situation, you've got Cincinnati favorite at home. This is a Buffalo team that's 3-1, but it hasn't been the sexiest 3-1. So I kind of wonder how much respect the Bills have gotten for their body of work so far, and this line may be a little bit of an indication.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you got to look at here is you got 2 pretty good defenses. I mean, when you think of really good defenses in the NFL, I mean, you think of Denver, or you think of Baltimore, the usual suspects that are kind of, near the tops most years on defense. But these 2 defenses are very good. And you've seen with Cincinnati, they held, granted it was Watson's first road start, but they held Houston to 13, and then Houston goes up and puts up 30-plus in New England. And then obviously, the game kind of got out of hand, so the score's misleading, but they did score 57 points. Some of it was off the defense, but the offense looked pretty good last Sunday for Houston, and Cincinnati was able to hold them down. Buffalo was able to hold Atlanta to 17, who had a couple straight 30-plus point games. So you've got two really good defenses here, and I think the total really is indicating that with it being 39 and even in some places being 38.5. So I mean, I don't think that the under would be the wrong look here necessarily. If I had to take the side, I might lean with Cincinnati because I do think that they're a little bit on the upswing. I don't know if maybe Buffalo, they're not a fraudulent 3-1 because their defense has been good, but their offense still hasn't really broken out, and I don't know if this is the defense where it really breaks out again. So Cincinnati would be my lean on the side.
Yeah, I look at that line and I kind of think to myself, I mean, look, it makes sense to me that these two teams are lined fairly evenly. And I mean, I don't think Cincinnati's got a 2.5 or a 3-point home field, maybe 2 points. So when you look at the line that came out with 2.5, a little bit of extra juice on the Bengals, I think that was a pretty good number. And it doesn't take much to nudge a 2.5 minus 15 up to 3. And some shops, of course, just went ahead and opened 3 right away on this game. So, you know, I just kind of look at the line, and I'm sort of trying to think to myself, you know, you mentioned Cincinnati possibly being on an upswing. Played well against Green Bay, at least in the first half. Fell apart in the second half, but covered the number. Beat the Browns comfortably last week. You know, is this a Cincinnati team that has a reputation for being very good in the regular season? Is this a team where maybe a little bit of recency bias and perception bias is hitting the board?
You know, I think it could. I think it could be because I think that these teams are pretty equal, actually, even though the records don't indicate that. You know, Buffalo was able to get a bad Jets team in the first week, and then you know, went to Carolina, only scored 3 points, but you know, pretty much shut them down and stayed, you know, within the number the whole game, and then of course. Getting Denver off that big win over Dallas in Buffalo really held Denver down and pressured Trevor Siemian. And Buffalo is probably one of the best teams in the league at getting pressure with their front four. You know, they're not a team that necessarily has to use a lot of exotic blitzing to get pressure on the opposing quarterback. And, you know, sometimes you worry about Dalton. Dalton is a guy when he's pressured, like a lot of quarterbacks, that he'll give the ball away to you. So, you know, this is a pretty tough game. I think the number probably is right here, you know, because they're basically saying with this home field that, you know, this is a pick'em game and these two teams are pretty dead even, and I think that they are, despite the reverse records of 3-1 against 1-3.
All right, we'll stay with a AFC North home team here. We'll go to game 457, 458 on the board. Jacksonville and Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is an 8.5-point favorite in this spot. I'm going to be very interested in seeing what happens with the line for this game because Pittsburgh, obviously a very public team, lots of skill players that everybody knows from their fantasy team. Jacksonville, you know, it's just been so up and down, so inconsistent for them. I think a lot of people are going to be under the impression that this number is a little bit high, but situationally, Jacksonville playing a third straight road game with that one in London against Baltimore, played effectively 5 quarters last week with a late overtime game against the Jets. This is not a good spot for the Jags at all.
Yeah, it's kind of like when I was looking at this, I was like, it's a bad spot for Pittsburgh off a pretty convincing divisional road win where they're now 2-0 against the division in the AFC North. And then you look, they come home, it is kind of a line that looks high, like, you know, you kind of want to take the dog, and then Pittsburgh, of course, goes on the road next week against the the main national afternoon game at Kansas City, who may very well be undefeated still. I mean, you know, they could lose to Houston, but I mean, you know, the team that I think everybody considers, at least today, the best team in the NFL. So they have that coming at them, so they probably will have a chip on their shoulder and a point to prove there. But bad spot for Pittsburgh, horrible spot for Jacksonville to go to London and then have to go to New York and then have to go back on the road to Pittsburgh, have not been, you know, 3 straight road games. Now they get 3 straight home games in December to kind of make up for that. But, you know, It's got to be a pretty road weary team. And playing the 5 quarters essentially, like you said, in New York last week. I mean, in terms of the number is telling you maybe there's value in Jacksonville, but boy, this is a tough game for me, and I don't know what I'm going to do with this game, if anything, because I'm not in love necessarily with laying Pittsburgh at the 8.5, but the Jacksonville, that's got to be one of the worst spots you can get with the 3 straight road games. So, this is a very tough call for me.
Well, and what I think is so interesting is, Jacksonville is effectively a home team in London. So, that win over Baltimore it felt like a home game for them, but still, I mean, they dominated Baltimore, like historic dominance of that Baltimore offense. And people start looking at Jacksonville and saying, okay, because Jacksonville's been that trendy, I want to love them coming into the season type of team for, probably 5-6 years now with the talent they bring in with the draft and some of the free agent signings that they make and things like that. And it just winds up never working out. Then they go to 2-1. They blow out Baltimore on the road. They beat the Texans in week 1, very comfortably. And people were kind of saying, okay, maybe this is the Jacksonville team that, we've been waiting on. Then last week they lose to the Jets, who coming into the season, people were talking about the Jets going 0-16, being one of the worst teams ever in the NFL. Well, the perception swings for this Jacksonville team through 4 weeks of the season are just astounding.
Yeah, and the fact that you look at this Jets team and they look like they're getting a lot of public money. I mean, because they're playing Cleveland. I actually like Cleveland in that game. We don't have to go into the detail, but I will likely be on them there because I think people need to hold their horses a little bit on the Jets. But Jacksonville, you look at the talent on the defense. I mean, the fact that they've drafted so high in the draft and the fact that now they've got a lot of these guys healthy finally at the same time with Dante Fowler Jr. and Miles Jack and Jalen Ramsey and all these high picks that they've had. Now they're all of a sudden playing, and you saw them in week 1 against Houston. Granted, Tom Savage wasn't effective at quarterback, but the fact that they got so much pressure from that front four when you incorporate Malik Jackson, the veteran that they got from that great Denver defense a couple years ago. So, I mean, they're really getting after these quarterbacks, and, they can put pressure on just about anybody. But, I mean, it's tough because I think they're trying to learn, how to win, and I think they're in a division where there's no real great team. Tennessee would look like the best team, but now they lose Mariota for a little bit. The Colts, look like they're a dead team, but they could potentially maybe win a couple in a row if and when Andrew Luck gets back. So, I mean, it's the nature of being in the AFC South. I mean, it's a very ugly division, and there's not much that separates these teams. So, but when you've had a team historically in the bottom like Jacksonville, there's a little bit of time that it takes to learn how to win.
Well, and what's really difficult, I know you're in the Super Contest as well, and this is the first week that we've got bye weeks. We've got 4 teams on a bye, so that takes 2 games off the schedule. New England and Tampa Bay, you're probably not going to play that one because it's a Thursday nighter. Then you have to have your full card in. So all of a sudden now, you're down to picking 5 of the 13 games. And when you start looking at a game like that Buffalo-Cincinnati game, like the Chargers-Giants that we talked about in the previous segment, Jets and Browns, Jaguars and Steelers, if you're starting to cross some of these games off, all of a sudden you find yourself having to pick 5 out of the 9, 5 out of the 10, 5 out of the 11 games. And this is where it gets really, really challenging. And this is something I'm sure I'll talk about later in the week in the Super Contest segment as well. But while we're talking about it, I guess we can get your thoughts here on it too, Wes, is that you got to pick 5 games. And at some point, you can't keep crossing off these NFL games.
And there are so many games this week that, with even whether they're professional bettors or whether they're casual bettors, you have matchup with 2-0-4 teams. I mean, are you really confident taking one of those teams maybe necessarily in your 5 in the Super Contest? And then you have the Jets and Cleveland. Well, Cleveland I know is awful, but do I really want to take the Jets? And then Tennessee, Miami clearly still off the board with the Mariota thing. So, And then you have another matchup of teams with, bad records with the 49ers and Indianapolis. Those are two teams that aren't exactly inspiring you. And so many of these games have very close lines here. I mean, you have Green Bay and Dallas, two public teams, playing each other this week with a line under 3. You have Seattle and the Rams, and Seattle, kind of in that second half looked like that vintage Seattle, and then all of a sudden now you've got the Rams having believers in going to Dallas, and the fact that their offense is putting up huge numbers. I mean, we've seen a light years improvement with Jared Goff's play this year. So, this is probably one of the toughest weeks I've seen because it is tough to find 5 that you can feel really confident in, and it may be you can only have 3 that you're confident in, and then you just gotta take your chances on something. I mean, I probably couldn't give you 5 today that I could say, okay, this is what I'm going to play. I mean, me personally, I think a lot of other people are kind of figuring that out as well, and in the same boat.
Oh, yeah. There's no way. I mean, Cam Newton and Carolina taking money on the road at Detroit, that's a surprising line move to me. Oakland up to a 2.5 or 3-point favorite with E.J. Manuel at quarterback. I mean, that's been a one-sided line move there against Baltimore. Minnesota, Chicago for Monday night, still off the board. You don't know if you're getting Bradford. You don't know if you're getting Keenum. You know what the hell you're going to get from Mitch Trubisky. It's a brutal week for the NFL, and especially when you have to make 5 plays. If you're just out there betting and you want to bet 2 or 3 games, cool, go for it. But when you have to pick 5 of them, man, there are so many questions on the board here this week. I know I'm certainly not looking forward to narrowing down this card, but I haven't liked the last 2 cards. I've gone 8-2 in the last 2 weeks, so I don't know, maybe that'll be on my side a little bit. But then you get to this Sunday night game as well. Kansas City, I mean, they've been virtually infallible. They've been a very, very good team here so far this season. Now, they got fortunate to cover last week against Washington, but still played a really solid game. They're on the road Sunday Night Football to take on the upstart Houston Texans, who look much better with Deshaun Watson at quarterback. Will Fuller's now back in the fold as well, so they've got another weapon offensively. Kansas City, small chalk or a pick 'em with extra juice out there, but it's tough to feel confident about this game too.
Yeah, and if you look, it was really weird on Monday night because Kansas City did outplay Washington. They were the better team, but they shouldn't have covered the game because they were never really covering the game, and there was probably a doubt whether they really should have won the game, even though they were the better team because Washington's got a touchdown, with 50 seconds to go. And it's not completed and dropped in the end zone. And, I mean, if you have that, then you have Kansas City having to drive the field just to get a touchdown and being down 4. So it was a really weird game, but it didn't make me look down upon Kansas City as a team because, I mean, they did control the ball. They did get bailed out on some third down penalties, which I thought really ended up devastating Washington. I think they had 5 penalties on third down where they got a stop, but Kansas City was able to continue the drive with the penalties. Houston, what do you make? I mean, Houston, you're really having to buy high here on Houston with them, putting up 57 points on Tennessee and really dominating on both sides of the ball. And I think most people looked at Tennessee as the best team in the AFC South of those 4 teams, that they were probably the one that had the fewest amount of weaknesses at least. So this is also a tough call for me because, I mean, as a team keeps winning, more people kind of get on the bandwagon here, and eventually you wonder when that's going to tip over because I think Kansas City's good, but I don't think that there's a team in the league that's a clear great team. I think every team in the league has flaws. I think Kansas City, could also be one, and a lot of times they would point to the off-quarterback play, but, I think they're usually solid defense, can be had in certain spots. I mean, you kind of saw on that last drive last week with Kirk Cousins, who I thought that was a fantastic drive to lead them out there. And, Kirk was able to scramble, and Kirk's a better athlete than I think people give him credit for. But, certainly you think if Kirk Cousins can do that and make some plays and can continue drives against that defense, that you would certainly think Deshaun Watson could definitely do that with his feet as well.
Yeah, I mean, there are, again, so many angles to this game and so many things to look at. And, if you're Kansas City, I mean, we talk about the parity generally in the NFL, and I know people hate to use that word, but how long can they keep this thing rolling? How long can they stay with that flawless record? I mean, not to say that I'm going to fade them just because they have a perfect record so far, but, it's hard to win every week in the NFL. And now you're on a short week going from Monday night to Sunday night. And you're going out on the road to do it. And, it's just, this week in the NFL is definitely one of the most difficult that I can remember in quite some time. And, from the looks of it, too, I think when you get a lot of these low numbers, I think it's one of those things where the odds makers are kind of looking at it and saying, okay, we're going to put up a number, but we'd like to see where we have to go, because I don't think that they're, too strong in their positions right now either.
I don't think so either, and I mean this is where I kind of go back, and we've had this discussion before with certain derivative betting. I mean, be sure to kind of look if you're not sure. I mean, it's tough to beat the NFL, for a 60-minute game. I mean, it is tough. You have freaky things that'll happen like on Monday night where you've got, maybe not the better team, but you've got the right side, and it's worked out perfectly if you have the Redskins, and then all of a sudden that happens. I mean, that's not going to happen every game, but I mean, you've got some things that do kind of happen in the NFL, so where, maybe if you're finding it tough to beat the 60 minutes, try to beat the half, try to beat the 30-minute game, or try to beat quarters, look at second half plays, say, what, it's a game I don't want to be involved with, but all of a sudden game flow changes things, and then maybe you get involved on a Sunday for the second half. And I mean, there's a lot of teaser games out there this week too. If you look at some of these numbers, I could definitely see Green Bay getting a lot of teaser support where you could tease them up through the 3 and the 7. Houston as a home dog, that would be doable. Seattle, I could see getting teased up. Carolina, I could see getting teased up. Philadelphia, I could see getting teased down through at least the 3 and down to pick 'em with the West Coast team coming back. So you've got, I mean, almost every single game on the board teasable around key numbers. So, I think that's a thing where that might give an indication to some of the bookmakers of, where the real money is going to be in terms of let's see where these folks are going to tease these games too, and not necessarily just on straight bets and parlays.
Well, certainly a lot of things to watch here, and of course, the NHL season tonight adds another wrinkle to everything that's going on. So, great segment today, Wes. I think we shed some light on a lot of different good things, and if people are interested in what you have to say and what you play each day, they can find that out over at Wes Reynolds and the #1 on Twitter, and I certainly recommend that people do follow you. So, Wes, thank you so much, man. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Adam. Always a pleasure, buddy.